Yes, we were speaking just now about the literature of the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the people of Ugarit that offer significant parallels to the Old Testament. So parallels. It doesn't mean that the Old Testament came from this other literature. In fact, oftentimes it's somewhat contemporary. And I can even make the case now and then that some of these parallels were taken from the Old Testament, but that doesn't wash among the liberals. They want everything to be the other nations first, and the Old Testament is some kind of derivative of that. An extreme example is Psalm 29. It seemed taken directly from Ugaritic, the language of the people of Ugarit, with only the substitution of Yahweh for Baal. Read Psalm 29 just as an exercise and take for the moment out Yahweh and put Baal in there, and you've got a storm poem that actually works that way. Psalm 29 is very short, but that's all right. Well, literary accretions, like layers, were built up, layer by layer, until after a long process, we've got to have a lot of time here, of many writers and redactors, that's editors who would change or tweak things in Scripture itself, the Old Testament crystallized into its written composition. Does that sound like evolution? Those are evolutionary terms. Long process of time and crystallizing into its written composition. That is so very different completely from what we believe. So now I might have a little bit of a conversation maybe between the documentary hypothesis person and the form critic. I don't know if this will go over, but we'll see how it goes. The documentary hypothesis, maybe I could hold up something on the one hand. This is the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis, the originator was Astruc, remind yourself. I'll go to the other side. The form critic was Gunkel. The documentary hypothesis would be dependent upon the book, the book that was written by Astruc, entitled Conjectures Concerning the Original Memoranda which it appears Moses used to compose the book of Genesis from 1753. The form critical writer, Gunkel, he wrote Die Sagen der Genesis, I guess he'd say. The sagas, right there, the sagas of Genesis, 1901. How can that be the truth? You see, they're talking about something else and turned it all into sagas. The originator here, the third category here, the documentary hypothesis attempted to reconstruct the history of Israel using the documents. Over on the other side, the form critic would say that reconstruction can't be done because of contrary evidence in the texts themselves. They were on to something, they thought, so they're going to stand against the documentary hypothesis. Beyond that, we have the documentary hypothesis saying that they use the analytical or critical approach. Their idea was to isolate documents of multiple authorship, showing a chronological order, and to write the history of Israel. Opposite that, on the form critical side, theirs was not analytical or critical, theirs was synthetic and creative as an approach. They define the categories of literary types, genres, to which the literature belonged in its oral stage, and write the history of that literature. Not write the history of Israel, but write the history of literature. Seems as if we stepped another step away from truth. Documentary hypothesis had its foundations in deism, remember, of the period in about the 1600s, 1700s, especially in Britain, frankly, and also Germany. Foundations in deism, rationalism, and comparative religion. The form criticism had its foundations in deism, rationalism, and comparative religion. Sounds pretty close. On the documentary side, you're supposed to look for the real authors of the documents, usually unknown scribes. Imagine making the Bible like anonymous, but that's how far this went. Anonymous. Over on the form critical side, look for the Zitzim Leben, the situation in life of an ancient literature, paying attention to pagan nations. And the pagan nations is the place from which you get the comparative material. So they thought they were doing that the right way. Therefore, on the documentary hypothesis, Genesis is a compilation of documents written and heavily redacted at a late stage, heavily changed in the later periods. On the form critical side, therefore, Genesis is a compilation of sagas in fluid oral form until written and redacted at a late stage. You just about come out in the same place in both times. So that's what we've got here, and I guess at this point we had our railroad up here, but I'll just draw this first car after the locomotive would be form criticism right here. It's connected to the main car. And now we're going to look at the next thing, the next car on the train, and that is tradition history. We'll call it TH. It doesn't stand for theology, it stands for tradition history. The traditio, they always do this, the traditio without an N, hyphen, historical method. It evolved with quotes around it. It came out of form criticism. That is, it is difficult sometimes to determine where one leaves off and its successor begins. So we're nuancing this, I suppose, at best, but this is the story as we know it from what happened, from the truth. Gunkel sought ultimately to rewrite the history of Old Testament literature. Useful in toward achieving this goal was the attempt to trace the historical development of particular units of tradition. Sounds like he's breaking things down in even smaller parts. We always say that some of these people wind up like they're looking into an empty bird nest or studying an empty bird nest because they get down to smaller and smaller pieces and parts of Scripture. And then they write them up. And after a while, all the writing that goes on gets pretty crowded, and somebody always has to come up with a new idea so there's room for their book, in the ongoing of scholarship. So particular units of tradition. We're taking a tradition, and we're going to see how that changes through Scripture. The method consisted in collecting the existing variants of a tradition from several early authors, editors, and so forth. Not to be confused with textual variants in textual criticism. I must make that point again. Textual criticism happens to use the word criticism, but that's neutral. That's everybody looking at the same text and talking about the different versions and their contributions to it. It's very, very, tiresome work in some senses, except for those of us who love it. But you're talking now about comparing the Greek Old Testament, the LXX as we call it, number 70 is there. They had the notion that 70, or 72 actually, translators all did the work of the LXX about 250 to 150 BC, and they did it without collusion. They came out, and everybody had agreed the text was all perfect. The translation was all perfect, but men 2 by 2 in something like a phone booth, studying these things out. I know that's not true because that kind of thing could never happen. Yes. So what they're doing then, this method is collecting the existing variants of a tradition from several early authors, editors, and so forth, arranging them in the order of development from primitive to complex. There again is bowing to evolution, and reconstructing the original form of the tradition as far as it still showed through the existing texts. Here, as in form criticism, Gonko was the pioneer with his Schöpfung und Chaos in 1895, wherein he attempted to reconstruct the original nature of certain mythological motifs in the creation saga from the smallest hints in the text.